Often, the question is asked, why did apartheid endure as long as it did when the black majority so obviously opposed it and the white minority claimed to have taken issue? Today, so many brandish the referendum that was the beginning of the end as a badge of honor, but very few, not even de Klerk, who was so jubilant about it, would or will seriously engage on the lingering effects of the policy and what became of the Afrikaners who were so convinced of the legitimacy of separate development. The answer is that apartheid South Africa, which according to the National Party was everywhere that had been cleared of black residential areas for white industry and suburbs, and definitely not the land prisons they called Bantustans, ran like a well-oiled machine due to the steady contributions of fervent white nationalists, the likes of which you'll meet shortly. These nationalists were administrators and professionals. Many were patriarchal heads of wealthy and influential families. These people and their ideology didn't get blown to smithereens when Nelson Mandela was freed. They got a negotiated settlement, assurances that the new South Africa would not be hostile towards them, and that reconciliation, not justice and restitution, would reign supreme. So many today distance themselves from the public visage of Afrikaner nationalism that was apartheid and project as fiercely patriotic, all the while proclaiming that neither they nor their families derived any benefit from the system, not a childhood free of systematic terrorism, not an education, not a network of contacts, etc., etc. Lovingly dubbed white wine. There is today in South Africa a tendency amongst our compatriots to decry, quite jovially, the failures of the ANC government, a tactic to safely disguise dehumanizing racist language as criticism on administrative issues, and to become impatient with the fact that either too much or not enough has changed in 30 years. They attribute their upper middle class status in a country where they're a minority to hard work, perseverance, discipline, and other things I saw on the walls of aggressively professional spaces in the early 2000s. Anyways, if that were the case, many more black people would be part of the affluent classes than is presently the case, and companies wouldn't be threatened with boycotts and shareholder walkouts for announcing stricter enforcement of mandated employment equity policies. No. The friction that dominates race relations is thanks in part to the lack of attempts to uproot the civic religion that is Afrikaner nationalism. And if we know the past history of nationalism, well, that should be enough to encourage a habit of watchful suspicion. What is up? Welcome back to my channel. My name's Bonolo, and I'd love it if you join me for this deep dive on the underpinnings of apartheid, from bitter einders to banker mentality, its cultural foundations and lasting effects that have got third world myths exploring who messed up South Africa. Hindsight shows that neither the imperialist establishment of the British Cape Colony nor the international community were prepared for the sudden rise of Afrikaner nationalism in the first few decades of the 20th century. They were slow to understand the depths of white Afrikaner humiliation in the aftermath of the South African War, which is what scholars and journalists now prefer to call the Anglo-Boer War, as more than two sides were involved in the actual conflict. We've witnessed a steady re-emergence of right-wing populism in the 2010s and 2020s, evident in the frequent use of reverse apartheid rhetoric and accusations of pervasive wokeism from among Afrikaner minority rights and liberal democratic circles disseminating political information on social media. Now seems like a good time to look at how the ideology of the Boers, a civic religion, first established itself so as to avoid making the same misjudgments. In the 1900s, the Boers were facing a steadfast group of outsiders in the form of George V's empire's establishment, taking control of the former colonies and Boer republics to form the Union of South Africa in 1910. In 1915, the last of the Boer guerrilla fighters in the war put up the Maritz Rebellion against the Union government, ending with the rebels' surrender. These were the last men who lived what represents archetypal Afrikanerdom to me, maybe even a cornerstone of Afrikaner nationalism, the bitter einders, so called because they had resolved to keep fighting guerrilla style in the last stages of the South African War, with the hopes that the British would retreat, giving the Boers back control of the territory. They were irreconcilable with any idea of collaboration with their enemy, be that empire or native. They were patriots of the folk, owing to their perceivedly legendary historical journey, and could not be governed by an Anglophone administration. Because of what Johan Fourie calls extreme patriotism, marked by a feeling of superiority over others, which accentuates artificial differences between peoples and punishes outsiders. In the early years of the Union, elder Boers would have recalled the events of the Great Trek, while the Battle of Blood River held biblical sway over Dutch settlers where their future in Africa was concerned. A visceral sense of us and them took hold in the hearts and minds of white Afrikaners that would come to define their social, political, and economic behavior for generations to come. Historically, Bittereinders held significance to the Afrikaners who had survived war and a competitive settler economy as real patriotic heroes who took guns in hand to kill Rooineks and rescue Boer women and children. From this flowed visual symbolism that was an important tool for normalizing the ideology as civic religion, as the goal had always been to rule the land. This symbolism celebrates ancestors who held slaves and violently subdued non-compliant natives, and who can be seen on sacred Afrikaner monuments. Johannes Balthazar Forster was born in December of 1915 into a big family on an Uitenhage farm. He got a qualification in law from the cradle of Afrikaner nationalism, Stellenbosch University, where he got involved in student politics of the 1930s, chaired the debate society and the campus junior national party. He could also never fully reconcile his ideology with the imperialist administration and sought active disruption of the Union government in his political activities. During World War II, he became involved with a grouping known as the Osewa Brandwag, the Ox Wagon Sentinel. Ox wagons have long symbolized a pioneering spirit amongst white Afrikaners, since trains of these were used to navigate the interior in search of freedom in the 19th century. Because Germany and the Netherlands had supported the Boers in the establishment of their own republics, the Osewa Brandwag sided with them against the Allied forces and started organizing around the same time as war efforts began. A centenary public commemoration of the Trek in 1938 was attended by approximately 100,000 people, another catalyst for the group's formation. The Bittereinders had held hope for a far-off war to divert the British Imperial Army and government away from what the Boers believed to be their birthright, and I can't help thinking that these guys had similar wishes. Anyways, they were known to be nationalist socialists with anti-imperial, anti-communist, anti-black, and anti-Semitic motivations. When the Union administration declared war on Germany in 1939, Forster and his comrades refused to enlist for service, choosing instead to harass uniformed servicemen and generally disrupt war operations. Their own military wing, the Stormjars, blew up electrical and telecommunication lines and railroads used by the US Army, but Forster was arrested upon becoming a Stormjar general. The National Party of Milan renounced them, but when they were thrown in internment camps, the old war wound was touched and Afrikaner support for the establishment waned. When he was released in 1944, National Party were waiting with open arms, absorbing the Osewa Brandwag. Forster was elected into national legislature in 1953 and replaced Verwoerd after his death, picking up the baton where the old patriarch had left it. They shared a joviality about South African public administration that cannot be stomached. Forster called Apartheid South Africa the happiest police state in the world and was described as billik in Afrikaner circles, someone with a cheerful disposition. Nadine Gordimer pointed out just how sinister this could get.
The easy life is on the white side of the colour bar, and I think all white people, all liberal-minded white people, have this sense of guilt. We come to terms with this guilt in one way or another. Women can afford to be softer, more charitable, regarded, as the more compassionate sex, a compassionate movement rather than something that is seeking for justice.
Forster had become exceedingly aware of a shorter run than hope for white minority rule in Africa when Angola and Mozambique declared independence in the 70s, leaving a few southern states the last outposts. He had already scrapped the last 4 colored seats in parliament filled by white members and still refused legislative and political representation for the black population. His legacy is a Stellenbosch University building erected on stolen indigenous land, a police station that was apartheid headquarters for special services, and of course, merrily maintaining the status quo, as Parker writes. He is included here as a stand-in for every single Afrikaner who actively supported apartheid to the bitter end. He was also part of a sort of president brotherhood, a secret society called the Inner Sanctum of Afrikaner nationalism, the Broederbond that bureaucratized state capture with legislation and corporate corruption. This started as a group of young white Afrikaners who were part of the new generation of Boers who saw a path to sovereignty in the language their forebears rejected. For principles, they had the Dutch Reformed Church to look to, making white male only imperative with the advancement of the folk as goal. Among its founding members was a Dutch Reformed minister by the name of Du Toit, who was instrumental in the translation of the Bible into Afrikaans and promoted the language and nationalism in Die Patriot Journal, published by the Genootskap van Regte Afrikaners, or the Society of True Afrikaners, since 1876, a time when upper-class Dutch settlers regarded the patois of Afrikaans as kitchen Dutch, denoting its use by enslaved people, servants, the less educated, and poorer whites. On the front page of Die Patriot, first issue stands, an Afrikaans newspaper. Who could have dreamt it? Most are like stubborn horses. They don't believe we have our own language. With our publication, we want to show the world that we do indeed have a language in which we can say exactly what we want. The Broederbond, Genootskap, and other like-minded Boers saw the language as a significant marker of the settler nation and promoted the idea that they had an identity linked to it, established when they were first placed in South Africa by God and then guaranteed rulership by their various violent conquests as a people apart. The Fifth Commandment heads the first edition of Die Patriot, as well as the Taal or Afrikaner language monument in Paarl, erected by the Genootskap, which features other interesting inscriptions, giving insight to the appropriation and deployment of Afrikaans. Afrikaans forms a bridge between the large, shining West and magical Africa, and what great things may come from their union. But what we must never forget is that this change of country and landscape sharpened, kneaded, and knitted this newly becoming language, and so Afrikaans became able to speak out from this new land. Our task lies in the use that we make and will make of this gleaming vehicle, and dit is ons erns, a solemn vow. The Broederbond was first conceived as Young South Africa in 1918 when it was just 37 Boer guys who all went to church together, sharing cultural and political objectives. It's clear in their cultural imagery and celebrations that the enslaved and indigenous identity inherent to Afrikaans is purposefully hidden, discarded, or subordinated. The same thing that happened to the earliest synthesizers of African, Asian, and European languages. The standardization of Afrikaans by whites played a decisive role in the discourse of power during apartheid through its exclusion of the variants spoken by black or colored speakers. Andries Petrus Treurnig, born in 1921, was a Broederbond member and leader. Once the National Party came into government in 1948, English-speaking bureaucrats, soldiers, and other personnel were sidelined and key posts increasingly filled by Broederbond members. An economic, socio-political, and administrative network of influence flourished under the guidance of the Inner Sanctum, touching every corner of the country and surrounding territory. Treurnig got a master's in theology from Stellenbosch, a political philosophy doctorate from Cape Town, and also served the Dutch Reformed community in various congregations. His efforts to rearrange demographics and culture like those who came before him inspired the disastrous Bantu education policy when he served as deputy minister after his election into parliament in 1971. In 1974, when he was supposedly chairman of the Broederbond, he decided schools in black areas should use the English Afrikaans instruction model for teaching math, arithmetic, and social studies, eliminating instruction in native languages and imposing a language that had been used to bark orders and dehumanize onto the youth. This, I believe, fulfilled Verwoerd's vision for the black population, that our literacy need only enable the performance of so-called unskilled work and, bonus, could distort history to justify white supremacist values while suppressing resistance and liberation. The Afrikaans Medium Decree of 1974 triggered the Soweto student riots of 1976 and hardened the hearts of an entire generation of young black South Africans against the language, with a strong suspicion of its speakers. In fact, I don't think we've fully come to terms with the plethora of knocks against black people's pursuit of prosperity from the National Party. When I think about just how many people were taught under that system and ended up thinking education or even social mobility is or was Lani, a waste of time that could be foregone if all there is to learn is the ingratiation of oneself towards colonizers. Terre'Blanche never took any responsibility for that or for his part in the regime, the continuation of which he supported strongly when the next National Party president was making liberal changes. Afrikaners had already achieved domination at this point, but their sovereignty was under threat in the 1980s as changes in apartheid legislation and dogma quickened. In 1982, he and 22 other MPs left the party to form the Conservative Party that Terre'Blanche would lead. They became the official opposition in 1987, putting up many campaigns against power sharing. When the referendum popped up in 1992, they got just over 500,000 votes against, not enough to stop the winds of change. However, Afrikaner nationalism was by then embedded in state machinery, macroeconomic policy, and South African society at large. Willing or not, most observed the civic religion. Meanwhile, those at the helm busied themselves with preparation for liberal democracy and attempts to re-enter international trade and diplomacy. The Broederbond upheld Afrikaner traditions dating back to the first days of settlement, colored by a nostalgia for the European way and cemented into the landscape and the memories of those it displaced. Tracker and tall monuments, among others, received little critical engagement after 94, so the folk can continue to make their sacred observances undisturbed, no doubt more inspiration for the myth of fated inheritance of the fatherland. In the previous section focusing on history, language and culture, I called Afrikaner nationalism the civic religion of the Boers. This construction was conceptualized at length by Jean-Jacques Rousseau as a public profession of faith that aims to inculcate political values and that prescribes dogma, rites and rituals for citizens, the object being sociability and a love of public duty or patriotism. The successful civic religion, according to Rousseau, unites religious values with the execution of secular law. When the Boers gained control of state machinery in the 20th century, they could imbue it with civic virtues carried down from their slave-holding settler predecessors, most importantly that of separatism. Civic religion might sound benign when understood ideologically, but Afrikaner nationalism is but one example of how often it's actually violently destructive. Said differently, the earliest iterations of what would become the Republic of South Africa tells me that the Boers favored republicanism because, to them, representation by suitable white candidates in any forum could deliver white supremacy, and adherence to this could guarantee their freedom above that of any other. Civic virtue is vital in republicanism, defined as the dedication of citizens to the common welfare of their community or country, maybe even at the cost of their individual interests. It's important to note that at the inception of the republic, the community were only white settlers, so that every man entrusted with the executive authority over the state since 1961 wielded, and possibly still does, that of the first commander of the colony, who desperately petitioned his government for slave labor, and that of the governor generals who operated for empire. The role came to be state president when this next guy came into the picture to avail broad executive powers to those responsible for the inculcation of Afrikaner nationalist civic religion in constitutional and administrative contexts. Born on a farm in the fiercely nationalist Orange Free State in 1916, Pieter Willem Botha had a real-life bitter einde for a father, and his mother was a victim of Kitchener's concentration camps. He would later be described as an aggressive bully with a strong opposition to black majority rule and the English specifically. probably normal for someone socialized into a Boer republic. In the period he entered and dropped out of university to become a National Party political organizer, there was a strong push for independence from Britain, the creation of a new flag, and the promulgation of Afrikaans, the true version codified by the Genootskap, as an official national language parallel to English. Furthermore, white laborers benefited from job reservation to eradicate white poverty in urban areas, while the black population had obviously extremely limited access to the market, going into urban areas for poorly paid manual labor. As Minister for Community Affairs, Botha had the following to say: "I'm one of those who believe there is no permanent home for even a section of the Bantu in the white area of South Africa, and the destiny of South Africa depends upon this essential point. If the principle of permanent residence for the black man in the area of the white is accepted, then it is the beginning of the end of civilization as we know it in this country. And I am sick and tired of the parrot cry of apartheid." I've said many times the word apartheid means good neighborliness. In tandem with language appropriation, Afrikaner nationalists created ethnic states for the black population, coining the term Bantustans shortly after the establishment of Pakistan or Hindustan in 1947. Chief architect Verwoerd argued that these were our original homes, allocating up to 13% of the land for our occupation, creating a ruling black elite to provide administration on behalf of white South Africa, and incepted the separate development plan in the interest of sovereignty for the black population. Actually, this was a maneuver to divert most of the valuable resources away from us by claiming that demographically South Africa was majority white. Nelson Mandela said about the Bantustan, "The hybrid word is in many ways misleading. It relates to the partitioning of India after the reluctant departure of the British. Partition was submitted to and approved by both parties. The government's plans do not envisage the partitioning of this country into separate self-governing states. They do not envision equal rights or any rights at all for Africans outside the reserves. The term is therefore a misnomer and merely tends to help the nationalists perpetrate a fraud. Afrikaans was and is generally associated with its white speakers, and its use to dominate, discriminate, and oppress cannot be disputed, as it was the apartheid government's medium of law enforcement and criminalization of contact between different races in matters of housing, sexual relations, schooling, and property ownership. Its black and indigenous component is denied in Afrikaner nationalism, but most speakers of Afrikaans are in fact black and colored. Extensive scholarship substantiates the fact that if the Khoisan and especially the slaves were not forced to learn or speak Dutch, then the Afrikaans language would not really have developed. It first developed as a contact language and was molded away from its origins. Racial categorization flowing from the standardization of Afrikaans to mark whiteness or civility was a similar endeavor to rid black people of their connections in history, language, and cultural values. The Bantustans were also part of the National Party's vision of a federalist Southern African region for which Botha advocated strongly in the form of constitutional reforms. Along with the establishment of 20 such territories, his government initiated the tricameral parliament. In 1984, a white-only majority approved the reforms, which saw the abolition of the ceremonial prime ministerial post for the aforementioned state president, which was head of state, government, and the military, answerable to national parliament, but able to influence the laws of the republic directly as majority party leader. This meant political and economic power could stay firmly in the hands of a white minority with a vested interest in keeping black people poor and unrepresented. The tricameral parliament was made up of the whites-only Volksraad, the already existing Westminster-style House of Assembly, the colored House of Representatives, and Indian House of Delegates. Good old divide and conquer, not neighborliness. The two latter chambers had no realistic options for outvoting the white on issues like education, social welfare, housing, and recreation, as it held sway over broader matters like commerce, defense, foreign policy, law and order. The National Party government insisted that population figures inform the constitution of the tricameral parliament, but with a 178-seat Volksraad and 130 for the other two combined, that was clearly a lie, to say nothing of the omission of Africans. The Bantustans and tricameral parliament achieved much separation but propelled almost no development. The four nominally independent Bantustans couldn't realistically govern without the assistance of white South Africa, which solely considered them sovereign, even building embassies in them. These were time, money, and resource drains kept alive by Botha, who knew that sanctions and divestment would throttle his economy. He frequently courted approval by relaxing some aspects of apartheid, but remained intolerant of criticism towards his ideology. His control extended to colonial neighbors Namibia, then Southwest Africa, Zimbabwe, then Rhodesia, Angola, Mozambique, and Botswana. During the 14 years he served as defense minister, the South African Defense Force took up almost 20% of the national budget, whereas it was at 1.3% in 1968. He spent exorbitantly on state security services, bombing raids to stop communism in Angola and Mozambique, death squads and mercenaries to quell anti-apartheid activists in Europe, assassinations, kidnappings, and torture wherever the ANC sought refuge. It's almost like he was trying to destroy South Africa before the international pressure broke him. The perils of bitter einde mentality. His government detained thousands of people without a fair trial, censored media, and rubbished power sharing with a black liberation movement. He refused to release Mandela after baiting them with an opportunity for negotiation, and when his stubbornness almost provoked civil war, he imposed stricter security measures, dropping the country into a state of emergency that depleted the value of the rand. It was his own ill health that caused Botha to step down as leader of the National Party, but when he realized they planned to replace him with someone much less passionate about enforcing apartheid the old way, he refused to step down as head of state. The man was adamant about his brutality and the subjugation of the black population of the region. Newer, liberal factions of the party sought out pacification through granting political rights, while maintaining unequal economic redistribution. Thus, some pertinent Afrikaner nationalist virtue could be maintained. The National Party's long-term goal with apartheid was the creation of a confederation of ethnic nation-states governed by racially segregated joint institutions that would ultimately monitor threats against white minority rule. In the 1990s, apartheid in its original form was in decline, and separate development gave way to the era of so-called power sharing. This reset was a continuation of the Afrikaner nationalist belief in the divine right of the folk to be in South Africa to rule, whereas a more honest approach to a reset would have insisted on some punitive response against human rights abuses. This reset was also the basis of South Africa's overly politically correct attitude towards institutionalized racism and the insistence on incorporating the good parts from the past and healing together as a nation. Townships are an easily recognizable feature on the South African landscape, the most obvious remnants of apartheid doctrine, that is, separate development. These were core elements of apartheid-era spatial planning, separated from the town proper by some buffer that could provide supervisory measures for black commuters entering their work zone and scaring non-whites away. These were not built residential environments, but rather emerged as dormitory settlements for migrant workers. However, from 1950 onwards, the state began building these huge concentration camps with rudimentary infrastructure and very little in the way of recreation, industry, or green spaces, under the Group Areas Act, stipulating separation of residential areas by race. The buffer was necessary to make race mixing even more difficult, expensive, and a greater offense. The National Party made it so that white-controlled city centers could only be accessed by a single road or railway line that could easily be blocked during periods of unrest. So, in the 1980s, about 40% of the black population was stuck poor and unemployed in the homelands, while yet more were trapped in the soul-crushing enclosure that is township life, commuting daily into a white area to be dehumanized and debased while you try to make a living. To start off this discussion on the lasting effects of Afrikaner nationalism where segregationist policies rooted in nationalism are concerned, it's interesting to note that some 20th century white social scientists wrote in support of separate development. One Arthur Keppel-Jones believed that devolution into federalist ethnic nation-states would result in harmonious cooperation among South Africa's polarized groups. A declaration of faith of this approach was signed in 1974, and a progressive set in the halls of Parliament advocated for a federal constitution for power sharing in the interest of empowering black South Africans since 1977, and has now become a conservative set representing neoliberal interests. An operative of the National Party, Botha's personal doctor Broederbond, showed just how far Afrikaner nationalists were willing to go to make the black population vulnerable in this power-sharing arrangement, by using townships to target and destroy black lives and communities. These massive tracts of land, essentially holding areas for an increasingly powerless black population without a state, were not well observed by mainstream social studies of white South Africa, nor the media, which was a key instrument of apartheid propaganda and control. Briefly, in the 60s, they came to the attention of international critics when large-scale forced removals came to the attention of the broader public. But until the Soweto riots in 1976, there were no insights into the socio-economic indicators of poverty, unemployment, and violence. Townships were a terra incognita to white South Africans, discussed only in terms of the general affairs of cost-effectiveness and infrastructure as they occurred to national government. On the local level, individual blacks living in the townships posed a threat to white metropoles all across the territory due to the receding boundaries between black and white. Basson, already well acquainted with the corridors of power, was recruited as head of Project Coast, a biological and chemical weapons program targeting civilians and activists in townships perceived to pose a threat to the regime, through which a deep paranoia and flourishing bunker mentality spread. Botha's Surgeon General appointed him to form a special unit of the South African Military Health Service, 7 Medical Battalion Group, operating as Project Coast, to collect information about chemical and biological warfare capabilities in other countries. He hired about 200 researchers from around the world and controlled annual funds close to $10 million, in violation of an international agreement. In order to distance Project Coast from the state, 4 more front companies were established to enable procurement of funds and chemicals. The researchers were unaware that they were working on smart poisons that supposedly only worked on black people, that the organization they worked for had enough cholera and anthrax in storage to start an epidemic by dispersing them into townships via water supplies. Basson is said to have been Botha and the regime's man of choice for attacks against the anti-apartheid movement, SWAPO, and protesters. He would oversee the modification of everyday objects to deliver lethal doses of poison, sparing the more dangerous chemicals for crowd control. He did his heinous work without interference and a massive budget, traveling to set up even more front companies and operations, which led to his experimentation with non-lethal chemicals for social engineering, allegedly orchestrating the sale of large amounts of ecstasy and mandrax into communities with strong anti-apartheid movements, i.e. the townships. When the National Party got new leadership and Project Coast was scrapped in the 90s, the researchers under Basson said they believed they had been working on concoctions of narcotics-laced tear gas. He was implicated in a joint investigation by the United Nations, United States, and United Kingdom that identified a nerve agent used against Frelimo operatives near the South African border in 1992, some of whom died or were hospitalized following exposure to the chemical agent. That some Project Coast privatized front companies from which Basson profited were involved in manufacturing or supplying. This and his involvement with the recreational drug trade led to his eventual criminal trials long after the regime had been abolished. When called before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he declined to reveal any of the work he did for the apartheid regime for amnesty, and the commission found that the South African Defence Force had probably used lethal toxins against civilians and ANC activists with Basson's help. In 1997, government agencies found him with more than 1,000 ecstasy pills and papers for Project Coast, leading to his being compelled to testify at the commission. They decided he should be prosecuted criminally, and 67 charges against him were leveled, including murder, conspiracy to commit murder, drug possession and trafficking, fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and theft in 1999. After 18 months, the judge reduced the number of charges, dismissing some important ones due to manipulable jurisdiction issues. In 2002, the judge dismissed the testimony of nearly 200 witnesses against Basson as a fragmented and confusing case by the state. How did Basson ruin South Africa? Well, if the law is anything to go by, then not at all. After all, the work he did was paid for and protected by the state until it wasn't anymore. But his foray into recreational drugs as chemical and biological weapons unleashed new levels of violence against the population that made it clear that townships, reservations, and homelands were not designed to grant black and indigenous people sovereignty. They were built first to keep us out and then, when need be, to cage us in. Black South Africa had been, in a word, rendered incoherent by generations of land theft, cultural assimilation, and geographic segregation and marginalization, resulting in settlements characterized by poverty and mounting tensions about inequality. Another staunch Boer and Afrikaner nationalist, Eugene Terre'Blanche, also had a calling to orchestrate violent repression of black and anti-apartheid communities, going so far as to threaten civil war in the event leaders of the Afrikaner nationalist movement were prepared to broker power with Africans. Born in 1941, Terre'Blanche grew up in the 50s when reverence for Boer War commanders like Paul Kruger and General De La Rey would have been taught as a history of heroes in any white public school, and probably an important part of the curriculum at one of many such institutions that glorified all aspects of Boer history. Later in his life, he became known for his fanatical eagerness to pursue an idyllic pastoral life in the Ventersdorp countryside and enacting violence on blacks who spoiled the vision in his vicinity. In short, Terre'Blanche saw the black population as subhuman and attempts to bring them into leadership as a bastardization of the principles that had birthed first the Boer and then the Republic of South Africa. That is, the supremacy of white Afrikaners decided at the Battle of Blood River by the sheer volumes of African blood spilled to secure land. For example, he quit his job in the South African police because President B.J. Vorster's policies were too liberal for his young heart. Vorster, with the massive military spending against the ANC, who had often tortured civilians and activists, murdering them when they refused to spy for the state. The police service wasn't giving Terre'Blanche the kinds of opportunity for civic participation he was after, and his disillusionment resulted in the formation of the Afrikaner Weerstandbeweging in 1973, a Nazi-adjacent right-wing resistance like the Osewa Brandwacht. The AVB was underpinned by Terre'Blanche's strong belief in the Blood River myth, somewhat of a raison d'etre to white Afrikaners, but initially ridiculed as a right-wing religious oddity by the new liberal elite of the 1980s that was attracted to larger markets in which to build white wealth as opposed to conservative political dogma of separation that slimmed profit margins. He certainly presented his organization as an alternative to the National Party and Conservative Party, but it was never intended to be the sort that would represent constituents in national parliament. No, the AVB were mainly concerned with assaulting anti-apartheid activists and destabilizing attempts at democracy, gaining public notoriety once by tarring and feathering a history professor who had denounced the observance of a remembrance for the Battle of Blood River as a secular event with no real history behind it. Terre'Blanche apologized but added it was important to consider just how deeply the professor's views had offended him as a Christian and patriot. He didn't really care who was in charge as long as he could be racist with impunity like he'd done all his life. He lived in Ventersdorp most of his life and is said to have run the small town like his own personal property in the years following the beginning of the AVB, amassing a personal army from there and elsewhere of plus minus 70,000 at its heights, and they busied themselves with horseback parades, disruptive raids, and generally running interference. In 1991, after the release of Nelson Mandela, he found a reason to accuse President de Klerk of instigating a riot almost as soon as he knew the head of state was coming to Ventersdorp to arrange for peaceful cooperation from his support base. This little interaction is dubbed the Battle of Ventersdorp and claimed lives. In 1993, the OVB stormed the Kempton Park World Trade Center during the multilateral discussions about power sharing with military weapons, just to hand over a memo of grievances about said power sharing. In 1994, he lied his way into Bophuthatswana, acting with the authority of a political or diplomatic official to open fire in public in a black area and to destabilize an independent Bantustan before it could benefit from apartheid abolition, only withdrawing when it devolved into anarchy. With the same mirth as possessed by the likes of Verwoerd and Foster, he was seen as little more than a relic of the past by the time his antics got enough attention from the media. In March 2008, the RVB attempted a revival following encouragement from latent supporters who were chomping at the bit for someone to point out that the so-called rise in farm attacks, the electricity crisis that had been brewing for near on a decade, overwhelming crime and corruption could directly be linked to the fall and absence of white minority rule, predictable failures of a black liberation government, and the lack of a free Afrikaner republic within South Africa. Terre'Blanche claimed that large tracts of Swati and Zululand had been purchased by Boers and vowed to take this case to the United Nations International Court of Justice. In his private life at Ventersdorp, he committed violence against many employees at his farm. The revival was on the heels of his incarceration in 2001 for assault and attempted murder, both of which he pled not guilty. He served 3 years for assaulting Paul Motsabi, who had testified against 2 white Ventersdorp boys in a burglary trial, following which an argument with Terre'Blanche ensued and Motsabi was left mentally and physically affected following attacks sustained from Terre'Blanche's dogs. This is alleged to have taken place during one of his patrols of the Ventersdorp town area. Terre'Blanche denied the allegations, claiming to have discovered Motsabi already beaten in the park. He was one of 3 white inmates at the facility in which he was incarcerated, and he claimed to have been born again there, supposedly tempering his views on race relations. The OVB colluded his redemption arc, claiming that the charges against him were fabricated by the black government and anti-conservative, i.e. anti-Afrikaner nationalist media. When his mutilated body was found in bed in 2010, the so-called Black Government by Jacob Zuma called for calm and responsible leadership. The Terre'Blanche family got to host high-ranking officials for their grief, and word got out that the primary suspect had announced to his fellow farm employees that he was now the new boss. Taking place concurrently with the rise of the ANC Youth League's Malemas Shoot the Boer era, his murder was supposed to kick off a racial civil war, but instead, the 2010s marked the emergence of white minority rights advocacy in earnest. Now, the referendum in 1992 was a vote on principles embodied in the Mahlaba Declaration of Faith, an apartheid-era agreement between black and white political leaders on the need for a non-violent transition out of white minority rule, introducing such elements as peaceful multiracialism, consultation, a Bill of Rights, and federalism. Belabored leaders of the impoverished Bantustans stood behind Harry Schwartz and Mangosuthu Buthelez's proposals. Schwartz made the usual sojourn through a few parties through the decades, but stuck to the federal dream right up until his Progressive Federal Party represented liberal democratic opposition to the state's official conservative republicanism. But they lost this foothold in yet another whites-only election that left them questioning their participation on principle, and they dissolved and regrouped a number of times again to re-emerge, first as the Democratic Party in 1989, now better known as the Democratic Alliance. In 1999, the Democratic Party was telling its base of former National Party voters, fight back, allowing them to gain significant ground in the mostly white Western Cape and conservative white enclaves in Gauteng. This momentum they used to gain ground with the new ideology of liberal democracy that had, in particular, no patience with the maladministration of the new black leadership. In less than a decade, most sides of white political representation were brimming with discontent, degrees varying from needs for spatial differentiation mechanisms to the kind of open hate shown by the likes of Terre'Blanche. Bunker mentality had been fertile ground for white minority rights discourse rooted in the itch to yell, "Reverse apartheid!" If the past was marked by ethnic and racial discrimination in political, economic, and social life, then the post-apartheid present is characterized by deracialization and unrestricted spatial and social mobility for all, an ideal defined in the Constitution and the present-day human rights ethos, though not always present in reality. I want to recall that sentiment about a misjudgment of Afrikaner humiliation in the face of defeat. For the time being, it's kicking up dust in what Marianne Tam calls oxcart politics, a sort of B-grade epic featuring Zulus, Boers, a white homeland, a divine call to lead the nation, diamonds, old Italian mafia connections, and a thriving online diamond dealing business that may or may not be a Ponzi scheme, with former President Jacob Zuma of the ANC trying to stay out of jail at all costs, including accepting money from professed racial segregationist Louis Liebenberg, who's on a caper to unseat the President and Chief Justice to pave the way for a new homeland. However, the continued use of ethnic association for economic and financial policy making and discrimination against immigrants based on country of origin have made it all too clear that some of the social reflexes learned in the apartheid era still exist, leaving me with the impression that the impulse to negotiate with our oppressors was incorrect. Laid a solid foundation for denialism and corporate corruption in government and in old money circles on one end of the spectrum, and the ravages of ceaseless inequality on the other. Why did apartheid last as long as it did? My long-winded answer is the subject of this series, but more capable researchers have a need to answer. Apartheid was not economically irrational for capitalism during the 20th century, but instead was mostly functional, until systemic protests and sanctions began to become debilitating. Skilled labor supplies became constrained, the limits of mainly white consumer markets were reached, and financial crisis hit hard in 1985. Today, that legacy continues in its most profound manifestations, including the still racially based labor market, migrancy, and the structured production of uneven development in nearly all social spheres. Systematic socio-economic corruption is largely due to a factor typically ignored in South African narratives until mid-2017, namely corporate economic crime. The representatives of the oppositional black majority, at least for a time, the ANC, find themselves at the center of hundreds of accusations of orchestrating corporate economic crimes in the halls of power, accusations that recently hauled the party through the commission into state capture, accused of generally colluding with white monopoly capital, but it is far less often said how this happens. Well, reminder, the national heads of important establishment families and leaders of important politico-economic organizations are the white monopoly capital in question, who captured the state from 1948 to 1994, got the post-apartheid national treasury to ensure lowered corporate taxes and increased capital gains for the already wealthy. Now, who would the already wealthy be in South Africa? Compounding racial divisions and inequality, post-apartheid certainly becomes too optimistic a label when wealth accumulated under the same system is lightly taxed, and when those who wish to keep that same wealth undistributed demand prudent spending on public health, education, and social welfare. Have a leisurely read through for more details, and then go ahead and rewatch Who Messed Up South Africa episodes 1 through 3 to fill in all the grey, blurry areas you have in South African history. My journey into South Africa after apartheid begins after this long exploration of our past. So share my work with all of your friends. Please like the video and subscribe, and know that you can look forward to some more modern topics covered, but only if you show some love for how hard I worked in putting all of this together. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. Let me know in the comments if there's anything I mentioned in there that needs more clarity. And check out A Short History of Stellenbosch right after this if you haven't already, for a discussion of this old money and generational wealth that I think complements this video. And that's all for this one. Bye.
Do it yourself. And I think most South Africans are very lazy. I'm one.
I think on that too. You go out to work, you come home, and everything's ready for you. You get up in the morning, you don't have to do a thing. But as Cynthia says, you have to train your servants, and that is quite a business to train them.